The campfire had died to ash when Jed Carter heard the crying. Not the wind through canyon walls or a coyote's distant wail, but something that shouldn't exist in this godforsaken stretch of Wyoming territory. He'd ridden these Dustwalker plains for 15 years, knowing every sound the wilderness could make, and this wasn't one of them. The saddlebag lay abandoned beside cold stones, leather cracked and weathered like his own hands. Inside, wrapped in a torn blanket, was a baby, maybe 3 months old, with eyes that seemed to hold all the questions Jed had spent his life avoiding. The note was simple, written in a woman's careful script. "Raise him if you have honor, cowboy." Honor. The word hit him like a fist to the gut, dredging up memories of his own father's failures and the promises broken in whiskey-soaked nights. Jed Carter had always believed that silence was the only honest companion a man could trust. It never lied, never promised what it couldn't deliver, and never asked for more than he was willing to give. But as he knelt beside that dying campfire, holding a baby whose cries cut through the Wyoming wind like a blade through leather, silence became his enemy. The child's wails echoed across the Dustwalker plains, bouncing off distant mesas and returning to him amplified, as if the very earth was demanding an answer he didn't know how to give. His calloused hands, more accustomed to rope and rifle than tender flesh, trembled as he lifted the infant from the saddlebag. The baby's skin was warm against his palms, a startling reminder that life could exist in places where Jed had only known emptiness. The note crinkled in his shirt pocket, each word burning into his memory like a brand on cattle hide. The campfire's ashes told a story of hasty departure. Whoever had left this child hadn't planned to stay long. The stones were arranged carelessly, the wood burned down to nothing but charcoal and regret. Jed's eyes swept the surrounding prairie, searching for tracks, for any sign of the woman who had written those devastating words. But the wind had already begun its work, erasing footprints and scattering the evidence of human passage like seeds on barren ground. His horse, a sturdy bay mare named Patience, stood 20 yards away, ears pricked forward with the kind of alertness that came from years of reading her rider's moods. She sensed the change in him, the way his shoulders had shifted from their usual resigned slump to something resembling purpose. The baby's cries had softened to whimpers, tiny fists grasping at the air as if trying to hold on to something that had already slipped away. Jed found himself studying the child's face, searching for clues in features too young to tell their secrets. Honor. The word had haunted him since he'd first read it, dredging up memories he'd spent years trying to bury beneath hard work and harder whiskey. His own father had been a man who spoke often of honor, but lived as if the word was just another tool to be discarded when it became inconvenient. Jed remembered waiting by windows for a father who never came home, listening to his mother's quiet sobs in the next room, learning early that promises were just pretty sounds that adults made before they broke your heart. He'd sworn he'd never be that kind of man. Never make commitments he couldn't keep, never let anyone depend on him in ways that mattered. But here was this child, thrust into his life like a challenge from God or the devil. He wasn't sure which. The baby's eyes, when they opened, were the color of storm clouds, gray and shifting and somehow ancient, despite belonging to someone who had barely begun to breathe. They seemed to look right through him, past his defenses and into the hollow places where his failures lived, the practical part of his mind, the part that had kept him alive through cattle drives and bar fights and winters that tried to freeze the soul right out of a man's body, began cataloging problems. He had no milk, no proper blankets, no knowledge of how to care for something so fragile it might break if he held it wrong. His ranch was a day's hard ride south, and even when he got there, what then? He lived alone by choice, had built his life around the certainty that solitude was safer than connection, that wanting nothing meant losing nothing. But the baby's weight in his arms felt like an anchor, grounding him to something he couldn't name. The child had stopped crying now, perhaps exhausted by the effort of calling out to an indifferent universe, and in that sudden quiet, Jed could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. It was a sound he'd forgotten he could make, the rhythm of a heart that still had room for something other than its own careful preservation. He stood slowly, his knees protesting the movement after too many years of hard living, and walked to where Patience waited with the infinite patience that had earned her name. The horse nickered softly, a sound of greeting and question, and Jed found himself speaking to her in the low, gentle tones he'd always reserved for animals, creatures who, unlike people, never asked for more than food and shelter and the occasional kind word. "Looks like we got ourselves a situation, girl," he murmured, adjusting the baby's position against his chest. The child's head lolled against his shoulder, trusting in a way that made Jed's throat tight with emotions he couldn't name. Patience snorted and stamped one hoof, as if to say she'd seen stranger things in her years carrying this particular cowboy across the endless Wyoming landscape. But Jed knew better. This was uncharted territory for both of them, a journey into the kind of responsibility that changed a man's very bones. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that reminded Jed of his mother's hair in lamplight. She'd been gone 10 years now, taken by a fever that had swept through their small town like wildfire, and he'd thought he was done with the kind of love that required sacrifice. But as he secured the baby against his chest with strips of cloth torn from his spare shirt, he felt something shifting inside him, like ice breaking up on a river in spring. The child's breathing had settled into the deep, trusting rhythm of sleep, and Jed found himself matching his own breath to that tiny cadence, as if they were already learning to move through the world together. The note in his pocket seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, those 7 words that had turned his carefully ordered solitude into something he didn't yet have a name for. The journey back to his ranch stretched before Jed, like a test he'd never studied for, each mile marked by the steady rhythm of Patience's hooves and the soft sounds of the baby sleeping against his chest. He'd fashioned a crude sling from his spare shirt, the fabric rough against his skin, but secure enough to hold the child steady as they rode. The Wyoming landscape rolled past them in waves of golden grass and scattered sage, punctuated by the dark silhouettes of distant buttes that stood like sentinels against the darkening sky. Jed had ridden this route countless times, knew every creek bed and rocky outcrop, every place where the wind changed direction and carried different scents. But today, the familiar terrain felt foreign, as if the presence of the baby had shifted the very geography of his world. Every shadow seemed deeper, every sound more significant, as if the prairie itself was holding its breath to see what kind of man he would choose to become. The baby stirred occasionally, making small sounds that weren't quite cries, but weren't contentment either. The noises of someone too young to understand abandonment, but old enough to feel its weight. Jed found himself talking to the child in the same low murmur he used with Patience, a steady stream of words that meant nothing and everything. He spoke of the land they were crossing, of the way the light changed as evening approached, of the hawks circling overhead and the distant mountains that marked the edge of the known world. The baby's eyes would open sometimes, fixing on Jed's face with an intensity that made him wonder what kind of future this small person might see there. Those storm-grey eyes seemed to hold questions that Jed wasn't sure he'd ever be able to answer, but for the first time in years, he found himself wanting to try. The child's trust was absolute and terrifying, the kind of faith that could either save a man or destroy him completely. As the sun sank lower, painting the sky in shades of fire and shadow, Jed's thoughts turned to the practical realities waiting at his ranch. The place was barely more than a cabin and a barn, surrounded by enough land to graze a small herd of cattle and grow enough hay to see them through the winter. He'd built it with his own hands after his mother died, choosing a spot where the nearest neighbor was 5 miles away and the nearest town was 15. It was a place designed for solitude, for a man who wanted nothing more than to work his land and be left alone with his ghosts. But now, with the baby's warm weight against his chest, the isolation that had once felt like freedom began to feel like a prison. How could he raise a child in a place where the only sounds were wind and cattle and his own voice talking to animals? What kind of life could he offer someone who deserved laughter and learning and all the things that came from being part of something larger than loneliness? The baby began to fuss as full darkness approached. Small whimpers that grew more insistent with each passing mile. Jed's chest tightened with panic. He had no milk, no bottle, nothing but the hope that whatever supplies had been left with the child would be enough to get them through the night. He urged patience into a faster gait, her hooves drumming against the hard-packed earth like a heartbeat racing toward an uncertain future. The stars were beginning to appear overhead, pinpricks of light in a sky so vast it made a man feel like nothing more than a speck of dust on an endless plain. But tonight, with the baby's cries growing stronger, Jed felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a yoke. This child was depending on him, trusting him to provide safety and sustenance and all the things that Jed had spent his adult life avoiding. The magnitude of it was overwhelming, like trying to hold back a river with his bare hands. When the lights of his ranch finally appeared in the distance, warm yellow squares against the darkness, Jed felt a mixture of relief and terror that made his hands shake on the reins. Home had always been his sanctuary, the one place where he could let down his guard and simply exist without pretense or expectation. But now it would have to become something more, a place where a child could grow and learn and find the kind of safety that Jed had never known in his own childhood. The baby's cries had grown more urgent, tiny fists beating against Jed's chest with surprising strength, and he found himself making promises he wasn't sure he could keep. "Almost there, little one," he whispered, his voice rough with emotions he'd forgotten he could feel. "Almost home." But even as he said the words, he wondered if home was something you found or something you built, and whether a man like him, scarred by his father's failures and his own careful isolation, could ever create the kind of place where love could take root and grow. The ranch buildings loomed larger as they approached, familiar shapes that had always meant solitude and peace. But tonight, they looked different, as if the baby's presence had already begun to transform them into something Jed didn't yet understand. Patience slowed to a walk as they entered the yard. Her ears pricked forward with the alertness of a horse who sensed change in the air. The baby's cries echoed off the barn walls, a sound that seemed to fill every corner of Jed's carefully ordered world with chaos and possibility. As he dismounted, still holding the child against his chest, Jed Carter realized that his life as a solitary man was over, ended not by choice, but by the simple act of hearing a cry in the wilderness and choosing to answer it. The note in his pocket crinkled as he moved, those 7 words that had changed everything. "Raise him if you have honor, cowboy." Honor. For the first time in his life, Jed thought he might understand what the word really meant. The general store in Dustwalker felt smaller than usual. When Jed pushed through the door, Isaiah bundled against his chest in a makeshift sling fashioned from an old horse blanket. The bell above the door announced their arrival with a sharp clang that seemed to echo longer than it should have. Mrs. Henley looked up from her ledger, her eyes immediately fixing on the baby with the kind of scrutiny that could strip paint from barnwood. Behind her, 2 other women, the banker's wife and the preacher's sister, turned their heads in perfect unison, like vultures sensing carrion on the wind. "Well, I'll be," Mrs. Henley said, setting down her pencil with deliberate precision. "Jed Carter with a baby. Now that's something you don't see every day." Her voice carried the particular tone women used when they were fishing for information, sweet as honey, but sharp as a fishhook. The other women stepped closer, their skirts rustling like dry leaves, their faces wearing expressions of barely concealed curiosity, mixed with something that might have been disapproval. Jed felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the same feeling he'd had as a boy when his father would come home drunk and the neighbors would watch from their windows. "Need some supplies?" Jed said, his voice rougher than he intended. He shifted Isaiah slightly, the baby's small weight somehow both comforting and terrifying, against his ribs. "Milk, if you got it? Some cloth for diapers?" The words felt foreign in his mouth, like speaking a language he'd never learned properly. Mrs. Henley's eyebrows climbed toward her hairline, and he could practically hear the wheels turning in her head, calculating gossip like she calculated change. The banker's wife leaned forward, her nose twitching as if she could smell scandal in the air. "Mighty sudden, this baby appearing," the preacher's sister said, her voice dripping with false concern. "Don't recall hearing about any Mrs. Carter." She emphasized the word Mrs. like it was a weapon, and Jed felt something dark and familiar stir in his gut. It was the same feeling he'd had when the older boys at school would corner him, asking about his father's drinking, about why his mother had left, about why he always wore the same clothes 3 days running. The baby stirred against his chest, making a small sound that was almost like a sigh, and Jed found himself instinctively tightening his hold. "Found him," Jed said simply, meeting each woman's gaze in turn. "Someone left him to die. Couldn't let that happen." The truth of it hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, simple and undeniable. Mrs. Henley's expression softened slightly, but the other two women exchanged glances that spoke volumes. He could see the stories already forming in their minds, the whispered conversations that would spread through town like wildfire. A man like him, alone for so long, suddenly appearing with a baby, it would give the gossips enough material to last through winter. The bell clanged again as the door opened, and Sheriff Morrison stepped inside, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. He was a good man, fair and honest, but Jed could see the questions in his eyes as they settled on the baby. "Jed," Morrison said with a nod, then looked at Isaiah with the careful attention of a man who'd learned to notice details. "Heard you had some excitement out at your place." The words were neutral, but Jed could hear the weight behind them, the implication that there were questions that needed answering, procedures that needed following, laws that might need enforcing. The sheriff's office smelled of old coffee and leather, with dust motes dancing in the afternoon light that slanted through the single window. Jed sat in the hard wooden chair across from Morrison's desk, Isaiah sleeping peacefully in his arms, oblivious to the tension that filled the room like smoke from a poorly ventilated stove. Morrison had been patient, asking his questions in the careful way of a man who understood that sometimes the truth came wrapped in pain. But Jed could feel the weight of official scrutiny pressing down on him like a physical thing. The note lay on the desk between them, those 7 words that had changed everything, now evidence in whatever investigation this had become. "No idea who might have left him?" Morrison asked again, his pen poised over a sheet of paper that already contained more writing than Jed was comfortable with. The sheriff's voice was kind but persistent, the tone of a man who'd learned that details mattered, that small omissions could grow into large problems. Jed shook his head, studying the baby's face for what felt like the 100th time, searching for some clue, some hint of familiarity that might explain why someone had chosen his campfire, his life, to disrupt with this small miracle. The child's features were still soft with infancy, unmarked by the world's cruelties, and Jed found himself wondering what kind of desperation would drive someone to abandon something so precious. "Could be anyone," Jed said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Lot of folks pass through these parts. Drifters, traders, people running from something." He thought about his own father, about the way the man had looked at him sometimes, like he was a burden, a reminder of promises broken and dreams abandoned. The memory sat in his chest like a stone, cold and heavy, and he tightened his hold on Isaiah instinctively. Morrison nodded, making another note, and Jed wondered what the man was writing, what official record was being made of this moment that felt so private, so sacred. "Thing is, Jed," Morrison said, setting down his pen and leaning back in his chair, "there's procedures for this kind of situation. Abandoned children, they usually go to the territorial authorities. There's families in Cheyenne, good Christian folks looking to adopt. The words hit Jed like a physical blow, and he felt something fierce and protective rise in his chest. The idea of handing Isaiah over to strangers, of letting him disappear into the bureaucratic machinery of the territory, felt like a betrayal of everything the note had asked of him. Honor. The word echoed in his mind, and he realized that somewhere in the past 3 days, this child had become his responsibility in a way that went deeper than law or custom. "The note," Jed said, his voice stronger now. "It was meant for me. Someone chose me." Morrison's expression was sympathetic but firm, the look of a man who'd seen too many good intentions run up against hard realities. The sheriff picked up the note again, reading those 7 words with the careful attention of someone looking for legal loopholes. Outside, Jed could hear the sounds of the town going about its business. Horses' hooves on packed earth, the distant ring of the blacksmith's hammer, voices calling to each other across the dusty street. Normal sounds of normal lives, while his own world balanced on the edge of a decision that would define everything that came after. "I understand that, Jed. I do," Morrison said, folding the note carefully and placing it back on the desk. "But the law's the law. I can give you a few days to think it over, maybe see if anyone comes forward claiming the child, but after that—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung in the air like a threat. Jed looked down at Isaiah, at the small face that had already become as familiar as his own reflection, and felt something break inside him. It was the same feeling he'd had when his mother had packed her bags, when she'd looked at him with eyes full of regret and whispered that she was sorry, that she couldn't stay, that some things were just too broken to fix. The walk back to his horse felt like a funeral march, each step taking him closer to a future he couldn't bear to imagine. Isaiah stirred in his arms, making the small sounds that Jed had already learned meant hunger, and he realized that in 3 days this child had taught him more about love than 36 years of living had managed. The note crinkled in his pocket as he mounted his horse, those 7 words now feeling less like a request and more like a commandment, a test of everything he claimed to be. The ranch felt different when they returned, as if the very air had changed while they were gone. Jed stood in the doorway of his cabin, Isaiah sleeping against his shoulder, and tried to imagine the place empty again, the silence that would return, the meals eaten alone, the conversations with no one but his horse and the wind. The baby's breathing was soft and regular against his neck, a rhythm that had become as essential as his own heartbeat, and the thought of losing it made something twist painfully in his chest. 3 days. Morrison had given him 3 days to decide, but Jed already knew there was no decision to make, no choice that wouldn't tear him apart. He settled Isaiah in the makeshift crib he'd fashioned from a wooden crate, padding it with every soft thing he could find in the cabin. The baby's eyes opened briefly, unfocused but somehow trusting, and Jed felt that familiar surge of protective love that still surprised him with its intensity. He'd never thought himself capable of such feeling, had assumed that whatever capacity for tenderness he might have possessed had been burned out of him by his father's cruelty and his mother's abandonment. But this child had awakened something in him that felt both foreign and utterly natural, like a language he'd always known but never had reason to speak. The evening chores took longer than usual because he found himself checking on Isaiah every few minutes, drawn back to the cabin by an anxiety he couldn't name. Each time he looked at the sleeping child, he thought about the note, about the stranger who had entrusted him with this precious burden. "Raise him if you have honor, Cowboy." The words had taken root in his mind like seeds in fertile soil, growing into something that felt like purpose. He thought about his own childhood, about the father who had seen him as nothing more than an inconvenience and made a silent promise that Isaiah would never know that kind of rejection. As darkness settled over the plains, Jed sat by the fire with the baby in his arms, feeding him from the bottle with the careful attention of a man handling something infinitely precious. Isaiah's small hand curled around his finger with surprising strength, and Jed found himself talking to the child in low, gentle tones about the ranch, about the horses, about the way the stars looked different out here where the sky went on forever. It felt natural, this conversation with someone who couldn't answer back, and he realized that for the first time in years, he wasn't alone with his thoughts. The sound of approaching horses broke the peaceful silence, and Jed tensed, instinctively pulling Isaiah closer. 3 riders emerged from the darkness, their faces hidden in shadow but their posture speaking of trouble. The lead rider dismounted slowly, his spurs jingling in the still air, and when he stepped into the firelight, Jed recognized him as Tom Brennan, a man with a reputation for taking what he wanted and asking questions later. Brennan's eyes fixed on the baby with an intensity that made Jed's skin crawl, and he could see the other 2 men spreading out, flanking him like wolves circling prey. "Heard you found something that don't belong to you, Carter," Brennan said, his voice carrying the particular menace of a man who enjoyed intimidation. "That baby's got family looking for him, family willing to pay good money to get him back." The words hit Jed like ice water, and he felt everything inside him go cold and hard. He looked at Brennan's face, at the greed barely concealed behind the false concern, and knew with absolute certainty that whatever these men wanted, it had nothing to do with family or love. Isaiah stirred in his arms, sensing the tension, and Jed found himself standing slowly, the baby held protectively against his chest. "Baby stays with me," Jed said, his voice carrying a finality that surprised even him. "Note said to raise him if I had honor. Reckon that's what I aim to do." Brennan's expression darkened, and his hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but something in Jed's stance, the way he held himself, the absolute certainty in his voice, made the man hesitate. For a moment, the only sound was the crackling of the fire and the distant call of a night bird. And Jed realized that this was the moment everything would be decided, the choice that would define not just his future, but the kind of man he truly was.